The 2010s were a great decade from start to finish. I've been working on this list for the last 3 months, shifting things around while adding and omitting my favorite albums. I've enjoyed reading articles and posts throughout December of other listeners expressing their appreciation for all the great music that's come out the last 10 years. I was inspired to try it out myself, researching and reflecting back on all my favorite LPs and how they've impacted me this decade. I've narrowed my list down to 25 albums, according to my enjoyment of their release, the impact it may have had on our culture and other artists, and how well most of the albums have aged. We'll start this list off with So Long Forever by Palace. This London four-piece was signed by Fiction Records, who's notable for big indie names like Tame Impala and Crystal Castles. And there's no doubt that frontman Leo Wyndham and his mates make a perfect fit. Lyrically influenced by divorce, breakups, grief, the album is a pool of complex emotions. Melophobia means fear of music, but there's nothing to fear about the album Melophobia. This Kentucky alternative rock group came back with their third full-length LP in 2013. Vocalist Matt Schultz said he wanted each song on the album to sound like it was written by a different band, and he did just that. Songs like Spiderhead with an epic beat switch near the end, followed by Telescope and It's Just Forever, conveying so much personality and diversity, bringing the sound of the White Stripes and Pixies to this decade. Lo-fi, gritty, but consistent, this album is easily Cage's most stable and polished album in the last 10 years. Gray Area, meaning a time in her life that really speaks to me personally, seeing she's the same age as I am, going through all the contrasts of life, whether good or bad. No two songs on this hip-hop LP sound alike, and Simz is bursting with confidence. I find this album painfully underrated, and all I gotta say is that you need to listen to this, and you can thank me later. This Philly indie folk outfit thrives on the sound of its predecessors, sustaining all the best traits of psychedelic rock. After 12 albums in the last 2 decades, this is easily their finest moment. Tracks like Where'd All the Time Go really resonated the euphoric sound they've been searching for up till this point. Despite their obvious Beatles influence, this album succeeds in taking those outlines and painting it in their own colors. Indie rock became huge in the 2000s. So huge, in fact, that it began to contradict the word indie. The Strokes, Phoenix, Interpol, Passion Pit, a countless list of artists surfaced last decade around the US. And me, an energetic, low-tempo hating high schooler, had a thirst for more. That's when this Northern Ireland trio came into the States with the charisma that scratched an itch of a lot of youth. 10 songs, just under 33 minutes, every song pops in cheerful dance beats with contagious hooks and rhythm. After the hype of their self-titled LP, which contained 3 songs that would go onto their full-length album and become singles, I knew I was getting another dose of the vitality I received from Two Door Cinema Club, full of pop bangers and polished dance beats, short and to the point. It's easy to write these albums off, since the sound is a dime a dozen these days, but back then it set the stage for mainstream indie pop for the decade, and I still have these tracks in rotation. Most people picture cartoon characters when they hear Gorillaz, but the real magic is concealed by former Blur frontman Damon Albarn, followed by comic artist Jamie Hewlett. A band started on a concept to deconstruct genre, alternative rock, hip-hop, electronica, pop, jazz, orchestral. You could define them as all. Features like Snoop Dogg and Mos Def to Lou Reed and the National Orchestra for Arabic music. Albarn gathered all the tools he needed to make this LP. Albarn's vocal appearance is kept relatively quiet throughout the album as he pulls the strings of his fellow collaborators, and Plastic Beach works best when he's the composer and producer, finding hidden strengths within his guests. North Carolina rapper, producer, and protege to Jay-Z releases his most focused album to date. Artists like J. Cole, as well as Drake, opened the door this decade to a more vulnerable side of hip-hop. It's widely considered one of Cole's best works for its consciousness, storytelling capabilities, and consistent production. For someone known for thriving on their own with no features, by the end of the decade, Cole has collected a roster of all-stars. He left Rock Nation to accelerate his own label, Dreamville, including Boss, Omen, Jid, and perhaps one of the most promising duos in my opinion, Earth Gang. Coming from an age where Circle Survive, A Day to Remember, and Fall of Troy were thriving, I found it incredibly difficult to enjoy the albums I once loved just years later as an adult. That was the case until I came across Instant Gratification. This post-hardcore group capitalized Tillian Pearson's clean vocals and clashes them perfectly with John Mess's screaming. Usually, an album that sounds this overproduced digs its own grave, but this LP is filled to the rim with energy, and I cannot get enough of it. As much as I've loved their previous records, I couldn't help but choose Bloom. This Baltimore dream pop duo is what introduced me into dream pop, an atmospheric, ambient, blissful genre that has really grown on me this decade, and I have this band to thank for that. Pitchfork's review on this album describes the LP perfectly in just one sentence. Bloom is also what these 10 songs do, each one starting with the sizzle of a lit fuse and at some fine moment exploding like a firework in slow motion. Almost every track begins with this naive drum beat that sounds straight from a child's keyboard preset until the remaining instruments chime in and completely sweeps you off your feet as Victoria Legrand's voice binds you to an infectious and seductive melody. Alabama blues group led by the insanely talented Brittany Howard, bringing the spirited sound of 60s blues and soul to this decade. This album starts with the self-titled track, a smooth and spacey ballad of life, transitioning into the engaging plucky guitar intro of Don't Wanna Fight, which won the group a Grammy for Best Rock Song. From the relaxing lullaby of This Feeling to the exploding crescendo of Gimme All Your Love, Brittany pushes her register in a way that's untouchable. Not only was this album a gateway for me developing a taste for hip-hop, but Logic's respect and understanding of old-school hip-hop swayed me onto the history of the genre. Tasteful production, rapid-fire bars, proficient storytelling. Conceptually, a coming-of-age autobiography of his upbringing and what makes him who he is. Fresh on Def Jam's roster, this hungry 24-year-old rapper had something to prove. Despite having no features vocally, the LP has a phenomenal roster of producers including m.A.A.d, Frank Dukes, DJ Dai, and Logic himself. From his extensive self-produced self-titled track ending in real voicemails from his father to the fun poppy track Bounce, this album is truly dynamic. This decade has been taken storm by glitchy, loud, experimental hip-hop, and Peggy has fans and critics watching his every move to see what he does next. Experimental hip-hop raises the bar for its mainstream counterpart and creates a syllabus for contemporary rappers and producers with innovative beats and bars. What's so great about this album is that it's simultaneously abrasive and catchy. A little ugly, but with enough beauty to keep you coming back. Peggy is one of the most unique voices and producers at this time, and there's a good chance you'll be hearing his producer tag in a lot of tracks next decade. With 80s revival, dark and transparent lyricism, and catchy dance beats, the 1975 hit the nail on the head this decade. They have begun to alter the indie pop genre and gather a diverse audience with their accessibility of pop rhythms and emotional understanding found in the band's darkest lyrics. Despite the heavy influence from 80s synth pop, you can't help but immediately recognize the 1975 sound in Maddie's voice. Songs about love, fear, sex, and teen angst, combined with the infectious synth leads from songs like It's Not Living, or the epic build-up to the glistening chorus at the end of Love It If We Made It. This has been the formula for all the band's albums since 2013. However, this is easily their most cohesive album and had them winning over a lot of fans who have speculated the band's maturity since their first two albums. Rap collective, boy band, comprises rappers, producers, singers, directors, designers. This album, created by a group of 20-somethings, hits the bullseye on its reflecting demographic. But these outcasts come together to be something in unity, expressing it through trap bangers and acoustic ballads. Coming from a Kanye West forum and growing and sharing ideas through the internet and Tumblr is something to expect this decade after Odd Future's upbringing. Kevin Abstract, Merlin, Joba, Matt Champion, the list goes on. Every member is just as important as the other, anticipating their verses, and you can't help but admire their effortless transitions in between the members. Saturation 3 was overtly the third installment of the Saturation trilogy, which were all released in a 6-month span. Collectively over 2 hours of material, they literally saturated the hip-hop scene in 2017. Pharrell Williams and Chad Hugo, together as the Neptunes, with hometown friend Shay Haley, are back after a busy Pharrell returns to the studio with his genre-breaking funk band M.A.A.d. Known for their experimental pop style with a touch of Pharrell's irresistible production. 7 years is a dreadful duration to keep your fans waiting, but with the amount of tracks and albums Pharrell has touched this decade, you can't help but feel those years have flown by. Pharrell wears so many hats in the music industry, and his brand raises the bar for mainstream pop, mixing in elements of hip-hop, R&B, funk, jazz, punk rock, all these characteristics that show up on his album, making it impossible to narrow down the LP to one genre. Pharrell continues to take risks and break barriers throughout genres, and once again, I can't help but wait to see what impact he makes next decade. One of the best indie albums of the decade comes from one of the best indie artists. This group connects art and ideas from different eras into a genre I can only describe as classical indie rock, with their classical music style arrangements. Frontman Ezra Koenig's creative medium has changed since his band's first album, but his cultural appetite has not. This album is full of multi-layered songs that are lyrically reminiscent of the band's earlier work, but far superior on a sonic level. After a decade of making some of the group's fan-favorite albums, it wouldn't be until the start of this decade where their name would become comprehended to the vast with their breakthrough album, Brothers. Dan Auerbach and Patrick Carney took the throne on myth-busting the old saying, rock and roll is dead. The world was ready for another White Stripes, another Seven Nation Army, and that's when 2010 kicked off with Tighten Up, a Danger Mouse-produced, Grammy-winning rock classic that would shine endlessly. Bands like The Keys would go on to influence the blues rock revival for years. Dan would go on to be one of the biggest producers this decade, including collaboration with Lana Del Rey, The Growlers, Cage the Elephant, and many more. With grit and rawness in the guitars and their instantly recognizable high, soulful vocal performance, they pulled the blues rock genre right back into the mainstream. While world music may not be the first genre you think about creating a big impact this decade, my personal taste in music as a whole cannot allow Beirut to not be on this list. Frontman Zach Condon has been responsible for popularizing Baroque music into the indie folk scene ever since he was a teenager. With pianos, strings, and horns, the band has created a unique fusion of indie folk blended with Balkan music to a product that's pleasurable and elegant. Throughout the band's discography, Zach's crooning voice moans emotional ballads to charming, plucky serenades. The Riptide is one of their shortest albums to date, but this 9-track LP is filled with impassioned melodies and eruptive horned finishes. Frank Ocean is one of the most acclaimed musicians of our time, and fans can't help but watch every step he takes to see what he'll do next. A career that started with ghostwriting for popular artists and showing the most talent in the rap collective Odd Future. His songwriting would continue to thrive on his major label debut. Detailed stories of struggling with addiction in the song Crack Rock to the track Pyramids, a 10-minute journey focused on a culture's falling of grace. Songs like Thinking About You and Bad Religion appear complex, despite the minimal synths and percussion in the instrumental. Ocean's adventurous and cinematic style of R&B would go on and restructure the genre as a whole. Listening to Channel Orange is an experience you won't soon recover from. Tyler is the ringleader to the previously mentioned rap collective, Odd Future, who have taken the last 10 years by storm. Early on, getting a big break from their show on Adult Swim, stars like Tyler, Earl Sweatshirt, Domo Genesis, and the internet were beginning to make an impact in the music scene with their alternative taste in hip-hop. After a trilogy of cutthroat ranting, childish love songs, and off-pace track listing, Tyler navigates to a more curated design. On Flower Boy, Tyler drops his bad habits of relying on shock value slurs, hour-long LPs, and his angry and offensive attitude. He appears to be focusing on quality over quantity on Flower Boy. The transitions from track to track flow seamlessly, and the outro song has me begging for more. Tyler's music has evolved into a more balanced track list, full of gorgeous jazz production, strong wordplay, complementing features, and emerging Tyler as a top producer till this day. Flower Boy is filled with catchy hooks and relatable lyricism, and whether it's your first or 20th listen, you can't help but feel comfort through every playthrough. Kanye West is undoubtedly the most polarizing figure of this decade, and after facing a storm of controversy, Ye returns to the start of the decade, earning a second win with his most self-conscious album to date. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is an album about fame, lifestyle, and ego. Some of Kanye's greatest tracks reside on this LP. We get a glimpse of Ye's early gospel influence with the opening track Dark Fantasy, that opens up with one of Nicki Minaj's earliest appearances, narrating the story with a cartoonish accent, gradually building up to explosive gospel vocals until the inevitable beat drops. The following track, Gorgeous, showing the world just how perfect Kid Cudi and Kanye complement each other. Power being one of the biggest singles this decade. The epic collaboration between Jay-Z, Nicki Minaj, Rick Ross, Bon Iver, and Ye himself on the track Monster. Or taking a trip down memory lane with the soulful production of Devil in a New Dress takes you back to a simpler time. Kanye has managed to make some of the best hip-hop albums of all time in the last 2 decades, and there's no doubt that his work will continue to influence artists in the next 10 years. Following a decade of top charts filled with Black Eyed Peas party anthems and bling-era hip-hop, we transitioned into rappers opening up to more vulnerable narratives, and even top pop performers like Lorde and Sia with melancholy hits. And Lana Del Rey was the epitome of this new era of sad pop. Lana was the first contemporary sad girl who sang, someone who owned their feelings and increased the volume rather than blocking them out with a catchy hook. Lavish strings, sonic seduction, and Dan Auerbach on production, this LP validates Lana's career with the success of her sophomore album. The production on this album was novel for its time. Gorgeous strings blended with tragic ballads over hip-hop influenced beats and somewhat nostalgic of the 1950s and 60s. This aesthetic music style has lived up all throughout the decade with top artists like Ariana Grande and Billie Eilish. It's easy to forget that before Lana Del Rey came along, low-tempo sad pop was not the chart-hogging phenomenon it is today. We got it from here. It's quite fitting for the album's title. I see it as a double entendre, as a message to the current hip-hop world that this group can continue where they left off over 18 years ago, and unfortunately, as a tribute to the deceased member Phife Dawg, who passed before the album was completed. This was my absolute favorite album of 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected into office, which Phife Dawg stresses his opinion in a verse recorded prior to Election Day and his death. The group pays homage to the current generation of hip-hop in this generation, and touches on a similar topic for the youth of this generation and kids. However, continues to reflect on political statements throughout the album. They even brag about still having what it takes after all these years, which brings me to my last thought. What impresses me the most about this album was the group's ability to revive their sound and at the same time adapt to contemporary music. Not only do numerous artists fail to achieve this, but Tribe created some of their best work after almost 20 years had passed. Kendrick Lamar shook the world with his commercial breakthrough album. This is a biological saga of Kendrick's surroundings and how they kept him from becoming another victim of his environment. With Good Kid, Mad City, Kendrick tells the tale of his upbringing in Compton, surrounded by peer pressure, violence, temptation, translating all of his trauma through raps and stories. Kendrick would go on to be debated as the greatest artist this decade across all genres. However, his obvious greatness isn't the main reason I chose this album for my number 1. Back in 2010, I had a corny taste in music. I was one of those kids saying rap is crap and put almost no effort into discovering new music.
There's not a lot of melody and there's not a lot of harmony. And thus, it is basically effectively spoken rhythm. And so it's not actually a form of music, it's a form of rhythmic speaking. And thus,
my coming of age was nowhere near the slightest comparison to Kendrick's, but it was the first time a hip-hop album really piqued my interest. Kendrick reflects on adjusting to his surroundings, achieving to be the best person he could be despite temptations acting as obstacles along the way. While these stories may be focused on his fame, street violence, and the music industry, you can still take these ideas and apply them to your own hurdles in life. Most fans would agree that every autobiographical rap album that came after this walks in parts of its footsteps. It's not easy picking a number 1 album. But not only did I enjoy this album the most, but it has aged beautifully since its release, and it's my favorite album of the decade. Thanks for watching. Let me know down below if you agree with any of my choices, and feel free to roast me on all the others. I've been eager to create a video in this format with all the animation I've learned in the last few years, and it feels great to research all my favorite albums and deeply understand why I enjoyed them. Here's to another great decade of music.